Okay, I'm going to use this final example here to demonstrate some of the concepts that I see students struggle with when writing functions. In my main program, I have 4 variables, right? X is 10, Y is 20, and then I have sum and product. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call this calculate function. And so I'm going to pass 10 out to X, 20 out to Y. Sum doesn't have anything in it yet, but it's going to actually share the memory location with the sum that's in the function because it's a reference parameter. And the same thing with product. So what happens in here is sum is going to be assigned the value of X plus Y, which will be 30, and product will be assigned the value of 10 times 20, which is 200. And these values, because they are reference parameters, the 30 and the 200 get returned back to the main program. And then at this point, after this function call executes, right, X will be 10, Y will be 20, sum will be 30, and product will be 200. And then they get passed out to the display function. So it'll pass out 10, 20, 30, and 200, and then it will just see out the statements here. So let's just run that. Okay, and you can see that works. Okay, so the calculate function, really its purpose is to take in 2 value parameters, calculate the sum and the product, and return them back out to the main using the reference parameters so that they'll then have values in them that can be passed to the display function. So it's important to note here when we run this that these should be value parameters because they're only going in, and these should be reference parameters because they're being passed out. Now, the way value parameters work, if I was inside of this function, and at the end of this function I say X is assigned the value of 9999. When I come back to the main program and I display it, it's not going to have this value in it. It's still going to be 10. Let me show you. See, it's still 10. And the reason is this is a value parameter. It gets passed in, it gets used, right? But if I make a change to it, that change does not get sent back to the main program. There's no ampersand here. This is important for a programmer to know. If I make something a value parameter, I can be sure that it's not going to be updated when the function call happens. Okay. So by making them reference, if they're changed or updated, like this is, this change will go back and be reflected in main. Now, if I take the ampersand out here, and keep in mind in order to get my program to run, I'd have to also take it out of the prototype. Let's see what happens. Uninitialized local variable sum is used. Now, the reason that I'm getting an error message here is because at this point I've changed this to a value parameter, and value parameters' purpose is to pass something to the main program. Well, at this point when I call the calculate function, there's nothing in this variable, so that's not really what a value parameter is. It has to have something in it before it can be passed, and that's why I get that error message. So that should help demonstrate a little bit more about the difference between value and reference. So when should you use them? Well, if something's being changed inside the function and you need that changed value to be returned back to the main program and used later on in the main program, it should be a reference parameter. Now, there's 2 different ways to get your information, your parameters, your values back to the main program. One way is using reference parameters like I did here. A second way is using value returning functions. But value returning functions are different in that each value returning function returns only one value. So if I want to write a function that's going to return the sum and the product, I can't use a value returning function. I would have to break it into two separate functions, one to calculate the sum and one to calculate the product. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to comment out this code. I don't have this part highlighted, but you have a little icon at the top that says comment out the selected lines. I'm going to comment out, or just put a comment in front of this, and I'm going to put a comment in front of this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to write two value returning functions, one called calculate sum and one called calculate product. So now you'll see that I have written, instead of one function that calculates both, two individual functions, one to calculate the sum and one to calculate the product. Now with your value returning functions, here I'm passing x and y in, and I'm going to return x plus y. The return statement is what returns that one value back out. So sometimes I see students like returning a bunch of things. I'm going to return x plus y and 7 and sum, and no, you can't do that. You can only return one thing in a return statement. The data type of the one thing being returned is your return type, in this case an integer. Okay, it's a value returning function. You should not have void here. There should be a data type here. And now I've got a similar function written here to calculate the product. I bring in x and y and I return x times y. Now you can see I put the matching prototypes at the top for both. The difference with these functions is that they return a value, so you have to do something with the value that's being returned. So if I call calculate sum, it's going to pass 10 and 20. It's going to return 10 plus 20, which is 30. So it has to return it someplace. So that's why we use this assignment statement here. If I don't have that there, it'll execute the function, it'll return the 30, and then it just throws it away. It has nothing to do with it. All right, so you need to store it someplace, and that's why we use an assignment statement. After we call these functions, we assign the return value into a variable. And I've done the same thing for this. So now you'll see if I run it, right? It runs as it should. But if I did this, and I didn't store that return value, right, you get an uninitialized local variable sum. And that's because here I'm trying to display sum. It's a value parameter in the display function, but there's nothing in it. So you have to really think about these. They differ in that, number one, the return type's not void, it's a data type. Number two, they contain a return statement. And number three, when you have your function call, when the function call returns, you have to store the value. So the display function, which is a void function, is a standalone function call, right? Come down here. It's a void function. You don't have to do that with void functions, but you do have to do it when you have value returning functions. Now, which is the best way to write this particular program? You could write it either way, and it's fine. If I was to write it, because I would probably use the first version. I think for students, a lot of times reference parameters are a little easier to understand than value returning functions. That being said, you have to know how to write a value returning function, because there's so many value returning functions that are part of all the C++ libraries and part of code that exists that you have to modify. So you really have to understand it. And I'm just going to come in here and show you one more thing. If we wanted to, I could declare a variable . And then I could return that variable. And that code would do exactly the same thing. You know, you can do it like this, you can do it like that. And I'm just showing you this so you have some alternatives. And sometimes students will think, well, I have another variable, I should put it up here in my parameter list, but you should not. That parameter list is being reserved for the information being passed into the value returning function. So if you were to do something like this, you're not passing sum into that function. Sum would have no value at that point, right? So we want to create a new variable. And, you know, some people get confused. Well, there's sum up here. There's some in here. Well, they're not the same variables. This sum variable is inside of this function only, and this sum variable is inside of main only. So a lot of people will keep the names the same because it's kind of referring to the same entity, but you don't have to. If that's confusing for you, you can always call this something different, right, inside the function, so as to not get confused. But again, that's up to you. Okay, so that should show some of the basic differences between number 1, value and reference parameters, and number 2, void functions and value returning functions, and when you should use them. Okay, I'm just going to run this one more time. Make sure it works so that I can post the solution file for you.